Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Wallace here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm an evolutionary epidemiologist with the People's CDC, here with an update on the COVID-19 pandemic. In part one of this week's episode, we offered an update on the pandemic, and you can find that on the People's CDC YouTube channel and linked in the video description. Here in part two, we follow up the Department of Energy's report on the origins of COVID-19. That is, we'll aim to debunk one of a burst of bull stories about COVID-19 that a new and powerful alliance between right-wing denialists and liberal minimalists are converging on together. There's that single Cochrane Library review that sort of concluded masks don't work, suddenly getting maximum coverage in nearly every newspaper and column, from rightist climate denialist Brett Steffens to liberal Liz Heilemann over at Slate. They all confuse random control studies for science, mask mandates for mask use, pre-COVID and COVID-era masking, and the political class's failure to pursue a worthy mask campaign for masking's field effectiveness, even as the preponderance of literature elsewhere also showed masking during COVID helped, even here in the United States. Those U.S. counties with concerted mask mandates, which were largely voluntary in nature, suffered far fewer deaths per capita than counties that went unmasked, even setting aside that no single intervention for such a pathogen is enough. An international team largely based at Oxford drew on masking data across 6 continents, including a 20 million person survey to show population mask wearing notably reduced SARS-2 transmission, with mean mask wearing levels corresponding to a 19% decrease in an infection spread. The team accounted for other non-pharmaceutical interventions and time spent in public. We see Argentina's relatively high mask wearing led to a large projected difference in the growth of infections compared to the impact of Australia's limited mask use. But today we'll take on another hack job. A recent Department of Energy report, yet to be made public beyond newspaper reports based on 2 sources, pronounced on the lab leak hypothesis of the origins of COVID-19. The department itself declared its conclusion was to be considered of low confidence, which didn't keep nearly the entirety of the political spectrum to leap up like jacks in the box. I told you so, and all of you who deny the possibility of a lab leak need to shut up. Sudden experts retroactively confirming their well-rewarded failures of judgment. I've been writing on the origins of COVID-19 since January 2020 and on diseases back to my dissertation at the turn of the century. This is my take on the debate about COVID's origins in the most succinct fashion possible, but there are so many twists and turns which I can't possibly relate here, but which you can read as I follow them in real time and republished in my 2 COVID books, Dead Epidemiologist and the just released The Fault in Our SARS. Warnings about lab leaks preceded the COVID-19 outbreak. A decade ago, then Princeton University postdoc Thomas Van Buckle and colleagues showed the population living within commuting field of BSL-4 labs increased by a factor of 4 from 1990 to 2012. The fields encapsulated nearly 2% of the world's population, but by virtue of the infectivity of any pathogen that might escape, could turn epidemic. The team mapped friction surfaces of the commuting time over which a potentially infected lab worker could carry an infection home. The resulting isochronal belts were used to determine the population within the direct vicinity of each lab. Now, the increase in the population at risk appears largely driven by this surge in global BSL-4 labs. There were 12 in 1990 and 52 by 2012. And this is all coming out of the post 9/11 and post H5N1 interest in pathogens, and the worry that if we didn't study them, then the viruses would explode into pandemics. By 2012, we have an estimate of nearly 250 million people appearing within a 60-minute commute of these labs. Smaller commuting fields embodying the urban cores contain much greater proportions of the population than expected by this geometry alone. The Princeton study joined a larger campaign of distinguished researchers warning of the increasing likelihood of lab leaks, including Pulitzer Prize winner Laurie Garrett, Princeton's Matt Keeling, Yale's Alison Galvani, and Harvard's Mark Lipsitch. The increasing opportunities for failure bend a rare event like a lab leak toward inevitability. In 2004 alone, 4 separate SARS escapes were reported out of the Chinese National Institute of Virology in Beijing. In 2018, the Wuhan Institute of Virology used a less virulent strain of SARS to test lab disinfectants. So even in the face of hideous conspiracy theorists, no one need pretend such accidents aren't possible. That said, the possibility of such a leak in the instance of SARS-2 depends on what the evidence shows. But if we were to pursue such a possibility, it didn't start in China. We need to pick up the story in 2015 in North Carolina. With USAID, EPT, and PREDICT funding, the EcoHealth Alliance, led by Peter Daszak, shown here visiting the Wuhan Institute of Virology as part of the WHO's investigation of COVID-19's origins, supported gain-of-function studies on SARS led by Vineet Menachery, then at the University of North Carolina, there on the upper right, and in collaboration with Wuhan Institute of Virology's Zhengli Shi. That is, they engineered, quote, a chimeric virus expressing the spike protein of bat coronavirus SHC014 in a mouse-adapted SARS-CoV backbone. And lo, they found out SARS was deadly to mice, which express similar receptors that humans do. Now, upon the Obama administration's moratorium on such deadly experiments, NIH approved moving these experiments to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the Chinese partner of this program. Whether such strains are the source of the COVID-19 outbreak is a different matter, however, for there are plenty of potentially deadly SARS naturally circulating in bats out in the field across China. The lab leak offers a kind of law and order whodunit that places blame outside the developmental models pursued by both the US and China that before the outbreak engaged in the deepest of collaborations, both economically and scientifically, including, but in no way limited to, the EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute. When such international collaboration goes to shit, like producing a pandemic, each partner tries to stick the other with the blame, all part of now separate campaigns at externalizing the resulting economic devaluation. And stateside, that's a bipartisan effort with Democrats and Republicans trying to outdo each other in their xenophobic projections. Now, yes, China and Daszak did try to influence the World Health Organization field report on COVID's origins, a report the WHO eventually rejected. As I discussed in The Fault in Our SARS, China did try to lay the virus's origins outside its borders. But all the while, the US political class sloppily weaponizes the origins for its own Cold War purposes. Now, while this is all going on, there's a more bottom-up hypothesis that places the origins of the lab escape in a different spot. So Jonathan Latham and Allison Wilson of the Bioscience Resource Project proposed that originally SARS-2 infected 6 miners mining bat guano from a cave in Mojiang in the southwest province of Yunnan, killing 3 of the miners. Samples taken from the miners and from the cave itself were subsequently shipped to Wuhan by Zhengli Sheng's coronavirus lab for study before subsequently escaping by accident, or this is the hypothesis. Now, there are other interpretations of COVID's origins. Despite writing emails to Presidential Chief Medical Advisor Anthony Fauci, here with Daszak, in January 2020, warning that the genetic sequences of early COVID samples indicated possible molecular engineering of the virus, evolutionary biologist Christian Andersen and his team would argue in a March 2020 paper that the virus originated out in the field, that it couldn't be engineered because its sequence wasn't like that of SARS-1, which is a terrible argument, as gain-of-function serial passage could produce deadly pathogens with different genetics. Now, other efforts were made to investigate this kind of field hypothesis. A year and a half later, evolutionary geneticist Michael Warabee's group placed SARS-2 spillover at the Wunan food market in Wuhan that was first thought the original source in early 2020. His team identified 2 different strains of SARS-2 in humans who visited the market in late 2019, there as shown in the upper left. That cuts against the notion of a lab leak, as 2 different events would have had to happen to explain the 2 different strains. Did you have 2 lab escapes, one after the another, in late 2019? It's highly unlikely. The team also conducted spatial analyses both at the level of Wuhan, showing the early human cases in and around the market along the right there, and at the level of the market down to the bottom, showing the cases concentrated in the western side of the market where live animals documented to be coronavirus carriers were found. So raccoon dog, hog badger, Asian badger, Chinese hare, Chinese bamboo rat, Chinese muntjac, and red fox. A team based in China, led by then director of the Chinese Center for Disease Control, George Gao, published their own report on the market hypothesis. The team collected 923 environmental samples and 457 animal samples, bodies, strays from feces, in the market early 2020. 73 of the environmental samples proved SARS-2 positive, most in the western zone of the market where live animals were sold. 44 positives were detected among 21 vendors, 19 operating out of that western end. The Gao team suggested that the breadth of the positives indicates the virus had been circulating for some time in December. The team's table of animal samples includes some of the species the Warraby team claimed weren't sampled, for instance, hedgehog, muntjac, bamboo rat, although many were indeed missing, including the raccoon dog. The team's figure 4A here implies exactly such unidentified species. Indeed, evolutionary geneticist Virginie Courtenay or Gogozo commented under the preprint, quote, figure 4A, it would be nice to show also the list of species with significant correlation, end quote, species other than humans. Lab leak proponents see the market as at best a super spreader event, an interpretation the Gao team reports or champions, the authors declaring themselves unable to rule out any introduction from outside the market from animals and humans alike, as far as outside China itself, and that's a position China's government supports, of course, although not, interestingly enough, from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The report repeats another governmental favorite that Zheng Lixi also floated in a talk in France, that SARS-2 could have been imported into China in frozen foods from abroad. And that really just is an appeal without evidence at this point. If the market is Wuhan's first epicenter, the Gao team explains, it's all a matter of a busy day at the market. Quote, the market might have acted as an amplifier due to the high number of visitors every day, causing many initially identified infection clusters in the early state of the outbreak, as indicated in the report of WHO-convened global study of origins of SARS-CoV, end quote. But the team also identified the western end of the market with all those live animals as the center of the positive environmental samples, implying the live animals were indeed the source. Both the lab leak and market hypotheses appealed to a kind of forensic model of disease emergence. That's why I brought up Law and Order, right? Everybody wants the crime solved by the end of the episode. But as Roger Frutos puts it, quote, there is no origin to SARS-CoV-2, end quote. And what he's getting at, it's more the collection of different strains circulating near human specificity that matters. Although his group does also add that the socioeconomic context driving the rate of spillover matters. And we'll get back to that. Now, there are several groups of unsung evolutionary geneticists tracking the spread in time and space over which SARS-2 appears to have originated. For instance, recent work on genomic recombination in SARS-2's inferred progenitor strains shows that the bat genus Rhinonolophus, the horseshoe bat, is unambiguously the source. Perhaps directly out of one such cave, but also maybe through a wild food animal or traditional livestock intermediate. Now, this study here, led by molecular phylogeneticist Spiros Lytris, combines recombinant analysis, geographic distributions, and bat species hosting each SARS-like isolate to offer a next-generation history of SARS-2's emergence. Long story short, the most recent common ancestors shared by SARS-2 and the two evolutionary closest bat isolates we have in hand are inferred 40 and 50 years back in time, respectively. That offers a lot of time, eons in viral generations, over which many multiple SARS-like strains experimented across species. The Lytris team reports multiple recombinant events across multiple Rhinolophus species. Indeed, SARS-2's closest sister group include Yunnan isolates found in multiple species of the Rhinolophus genus, with more recombinant segments originating in other provinces and in other kinds of coronaviruses, nowhere near related to SARS-2. To quote the team, these relationships indicate ancestral movement of the coronaviruses across large geographic ranges in China, spanning Yunnan in southwest China and Zhejiang on the East Coast, end quote. Now, that range may expand farther as new isolates are collected, including, as shown here, into Thailand and Cambodia. So bats' long-range migration helps frame the extent of the natural spread and evolutionary recombination of SARS-like coronaviruses. But what accounts for the increasing spillover into human populations? The emergence of COVID-19 and other SARS-like viruses appears folded into China's own self-exploitation under a BRICS model that moved millions out of poverty, if at the expense of landscape resilience to disease spread. Despite more recent regional afforestation, we see here the land use change in the Lake Dianchi watershed in Yunnan, 1974 to 2008, which ironically enough was not far from the Mojiang Cave. Neoliberal circuits of production drive disease emergence elsewhere in the world, from swine flu emerging post-NAFTA outside Mexico City to post-structural adjustment Ebola in West Africa. So it isn't just about China. In short, while the various hypotheses for COVID's origins compete with each other, they also might help enrich each other. So for instance, Wei Xie and colleagues proposed that the industrial African swine fever outbreak there in the top left that cut into domestic hog supply the year before, the other maps at the top, and increased hog price and volatility on the side maps in the middle, may have driven an increase in incursions upon bats, as represented by new freeways laid down there in the bottom right. And that might have to do with the greater rate of spillover of SARS, including in Yunnan. Now, the problem with this hypothesis is that it presumes that SARS-2 arose in 2019, which the evolutionary genomics modeling that we just reviewed doesn't support, placing SARS-2 in human populations years before. But the key point stands. With multiple proto-pandemic pathogens emerging in parallel, the socio-ecological combinations driving disease emergence may be increasing. So there's no need to get sucked into the dumbest jingoistic face-offs imaginable. There's no need to take on the expedient political impulses of a political class aiming to wash its hands of its role in driving disease emergence worldwide. Indeed, whichever hypothesis, lab or wet market, turns out to be correct as a proximate explanation, largely misses the point. Global landscapes are expropriated by circuits of capital, with capital accumulation in countries other than the countries sourcing the natural resources in red on top, and the consumption abroad on the bottom across croplands, pasturelands, and forests. And that includes China itself. So New York investment bank Goldman Sachs took 60% stock in Shuangwei Investment and Development, part of the giant Chinese agribusiness that bought US-based Smithfield Foods, the largest hog producer in the world. For $300 million, Goldman Sachs also scored out-and-out ownership of 10 poultry farms in Fujian and Hunan, one province over from Wuhan, and well within that city's wild foods catchment. Goldman Sachs invested up to another $300 million alongside Deutsche Bank in hog raising in the same provinces. The US is beating up China on COVID's origins to stick its inter-imperial rival with the worst of the damage of the devaluation of a global capitalist system it helped found, and that is grinding against global ecological and epidemiological limits. Those are the origins of COVID-19. And that's our second part of our COVID This Week for this week. You can learn more about the People's CDC and read this week's COVID weather report at our website, peoplecdc.org.